Hi, this is International Master Erik Kislik, and in this video I want to follow up on the interview I did last week on the Perpetual Chess podcast. I want to thank Ben Johnson. I think he does a really good job with his interviews. I've done some interviews with Grandmaster Hjorvar Grederson, International Masters John Bartholomew, Michael Mulyar, and Cyrus Lakdawala. And it's quite difficult actually putting it all together, asking questions, maintaining the flow. But I really do want to get into people's personal discoveries, the novelties they've played, their creative output. I love the whole discussion of ideas, arguments, just the way their thoughts flow. All of that is very, very interesting to me. What I especially love is when people say things that are just really unexpected and you just go, oh, wow, I never thought about it that way. That's part of the joy of it all. But anyway, we got a lot of feedback. There were a bunch of questions I didn't get to, so I want to address as much of that as I can. And my favorite part really are the hard questions. The hard questions are the most interesting. And also with students, hard positions are the most interesting. If someone can answer immediately and be totally correct, well, maybe not that much thinking has to go into it. But I like ones that are pretty open-ended, and so I think the ones I've selected here are definitely ones that will make us think a bit. So let's jump into it. All right, first question. What would you say is the main reason why some players seem to actively play for decades, yet never break past a certain threshold? Under 2200, is it more of a self-imposed psychological wall, insufficient dedication towards targeted study, or something else? That's starting off with a pretty hard one, but that's what we wanted. All right, well, I think one of the first things is that a lot of players just have negative thoughts about their own ability. And when I was 2308 trying to become IM, one guy said, oh, are you going to quit now? Or are you going to go home or something? And it just never would cross my mind. I just thought, I'm on a good path. I'm doing my work. I'm being consistent. So I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. And yeah, consistent targeted study does work very, very well in chess. So first of all, negative thoughts. Yeah, that's a definite thing that holds a lot of people back. I think there are a lot of players who are 2250 who don't think about pursuing FM, or who are low 2300 who don't think about pursuing IM when it's definitely within their reach. So that's one of them. Another big one is just lack of experience against stronger players. That's huge. You have to kind of play against the stronger opposition to have some experience with the way they play the openings, the way they try to put you under pressure, the types of tactical ideas that they might play, the types of subtle moves that you might miss. I mean, certain moves like sliding moves, one square quiet moves, those are things that I kind of got acquainted with as I crossed 2100, 2200. I started facing more and more of these subtle quiet moves, and then I had to adapt to it, and that was just a natural part of it. I would also say that a lack of a framework to build on is a big problem for many players. If they don't have a clear way of thinking, it makes it a lot harder. I would also say just kind of a lack of classic game knowledge is a big thing too. For example, not having studied Alekine's games, Fischer's games. One thing that I did in 2008 was I played through, I think, 200 Fischer games in the Rai Lopez. And there was an international master I knew who was trying to become grandmaster. And so while we were both studying, we decided to go through all these Fischer White games in the Rai Lopez. It was a great use of our time. And I would also say that a really big thing that holds people back, for instance, I know that this holds back some international masters. At the very least, it restricts them and prevents them from playing other things, not reevaluating your old conclusions. So, for example, this one international master I was analyzing with had analyzed a line in the 90s, he's in his 40s, and he concluded that the whole position type, the whole class of positions was equal for black. But players nowadays know that the positions aren't good for black. So it was simply a matter of reevaluating his previous beliefs. So that's important. It's important to reset and reevaluate. And you might have to rethink some of the things that you thought were obvious before, but you may have been wrong about. All right, next one. Comparing some of the classic game collections like Alekhine, Tall, Fischer versus the modern ones like Shirov, Kramnik, and Anand. Are there many differences in terms of what one can take away from each? Or are they somewhat interchangeable? Okay, another hard question. Well, one thing I would say is that, and actually this was a very good point that was brought up by National Master Daniel Clancy. He mentioned that with the Alekhine games, he won a lot of simul games in very clear and powerful ways by tanking at the critical moment and then kind of executing with a number of powerful blows. And many players who were playing simuls would have just played kind of cliche moves, and it wouldn't have been that I was going to say destructive, but it wouldn't have made such a big impact. But I do think that just seeing those powerful Alekhine games is very useful for sure. You don't have to be so critical about every single move or every single piece of analysis. It's mostly just kind of following the trend of how he was trying to build up his attacks, how he carried them out. Kasparov was a big fan of Alekhine's best games and just his games in general. So with those, I would say you don't have to focus on specificity. You can mostly focus on the general thrust of the play, the general direction of the play, and also just kind of listening to his narrative and his thought process. That was one of the main things that I took away from games collections. What was the logic they were using to make their moves? Tall's best games, if we take those examples, Tall or Fischer, there are certainly some mistakes in Tall's best games, or Mikhail Tal, My Life in Games, but a lot of great games in there, a ton of great games in there. So I would mostly try to understand the decisions that they made and how they made them. And you don't have to focus that much on exact specificity. So, but taking some of the more recent ones like Shirov, Fire on Board 2, the quality of analysis is quite high in Fire on Board 2. Kramnik, My Life in Games, and then there's the Anand book, the World Champion Edition, edited, with the last games put in by John Nunn. The quality of analysis is very high in that. So I would definitely say with Fire on Board 2 and with Anand's best games and Kramnik's Life in Games, you can play through all the notes and you don't have to have that feeling. I like being able to go through things and not have that feeling of, do I have to check this? Might there be a really big mistake here that they didn't catch? The quality of analysis is very high in them. The quality of analysis was a little lower in Fire on Board, the first book, but I really like the kind of stream of consciousness Shirov thought process. It sort of seemed like he annotated those games right after he played them. So in a nutshell, kind of the differences between these games collections, I would say that with the Alekhine, Tall, Fischer type ones, Oive, Smyslov, it's mostly just kind of getting into the mindset of what type of justifications did they use, what kind of play were they aiming for, how did they conduct their attacks, things like that. More just kind of generally understanding why they went for what they went for. And with certain players like Alekhine, of course, it's seeing the power that he played with. Whereas with some of the more modern ones, you can certainly play through every single note and go through every single little detail and take those very literally. So, all right, let's go on to the next one. It's interesting that you mentioned going through Smyslov's games and that you not only recognize the tactical patterns, but how he prepared the tactical motif to work. Do you remember all the games you study or only some of the ideas? Okay, that's an important question. That's probably based somewhat on a player's specific confidence. They might think to themselves, if I can't remember everything, then maybe I'm not cut out for chess. Well, I think that's a very unhealthy way to think about it. For the most part, very, very few players have Vishy Anand's memory. he was on some TV show where he was shown a bunch of positions and he recalled who played the games and where they were played. Well, that's an extreme exception. My guess is that 99% of GMs really aren't like that. And all the GMs that I've worked with personally were not like that. So, and Emanuel Lasker himself said the main thing you want to focus on is playing methods, playing ideas, plans, patterns, things that you can directly apply. The one exception though, is if it's a very, very memorable tournament for some particular reason. For example, let's say it was a game played in a World Championship match or in a World Championship candidates tournament. Those ones might be more memorable. Or if it was for some reason maybe a ninth round game or a decisive game in a tournament or a World Cup game, those can be special exceptions. And of course, if Magnus Carlsen played it or one of the absolute best players in the world. But barring a really memorable tournament or a really, really memorable player of the top 2 or 3, let's say, for the most part, you shouldn't try to memorize all those. Part of the reason is because we see so many things. We see so many games. I see probably 100 games a day. There's no way to remember all that. So what I would say, though, is I do link the ideas to players. I go, oh, yeah, Carlsen played that. Oh, yeah, that was an idea Carlsen played in the World Championship match. So those types of things, if we have some kind of memory hook, then it will definitely help us. But what we want to do is we want to focus on the concepts and we want to focus on kind of what made the ideas work. And if you do that, then you're, like Lasker was saying, then you're learning the method and you don't have to focus on memorizing anything strange about the example. So it's all just kind of right there. Okay, let's go to the next one. Do you believe that different methods are better for teaching, coaching adult improvers than with kids under 13 and very young players? Well, what I would say here is kind of the difference between concepts versus patterns. And I would say with most adult players, you want to really focus on concepts. And with young players, really young players, the patterns are huge. The patterns are huge. I would say most of the players who are 10, 11 years old who are familiar with their openings and the typical plans in them can play those positions very well. And a lot of that is just pure pattern recognition. So one of the most surprising things anyone told me in the interviews that I've done with players was that when International Master Michael Muljar told me about showing theory to young players, at first I was kind of taken aback, but then I thought, well, I can see that. I can see that because their memories are so strong and they're so good at playing the exact ideas that they've seen before. But in a way, it's kind of like understanding versus quantity of ideas. And I think that generally speaking with adult players, you got to focus on understanding. If the example isn't understood, we just can't apply it that well. And but from the other side, if you're coaching a 9-year-old player, you really do want to focus on quantity of ideas. And the unconscious brain is a very curious thing. A lot of connections are made, so sometimes it fills in the gaps for us. But in a way, it's sort of like every detail. It's kind of like going over every single detail versus aiming for general understanding. And for the most part, I would say that if you focus on every single detail with adult players and just grasping every element of a complex position, that'll definitely be the best way to set them up to handle complicated positions. All right, let's go on to the next one. What, if anything, do you think that people attempting to teach adult improvers do wrong? Tough question. Well, I would say one thing is not emphasizing concepts enough. When we really put a strong emphasis on concepts, it makes our thinking a lot clearer. So, for example, one of the concepts, pawn breaks. Let's say you're playing a closed position and you're focusing on the different pawn breaks you can play. If you think about it from a very clear perspective, that definitely helps them out in terms of just dealing with the tension of such a complicated position. And I think a lot of players don't realize that in these sorts of closed positions, time may matter, and so sometimes you really do have to play very critically in those types of positions. I would also say that adult improvers are often just kind of given vague advice, and the vague advice is can sometimes be unhelpful. For example, just study tactics. And when somebody says that, well, okay, so what happens if you see tons and tons of patterns and then you don't see improvement? Well, that can be a big problem if that's not emphasized. If the actual kind of justification of the tactic isn't emphasized. So really understanding those things is very, very important. So I would say that not nearly enough emphasis is put on understanding tactics and kind of what the underlying weakness was that allowed a given tactic to exist. I would also say that things like improving the worst place piece just aren't really emphasized that much either, and really focusing on a solid understanding of piece activity and coordination. Last thing I would say about adult improvers is that a lot of them are kind of set up to fail by being given impossible projects. If you give somebody an impossible project that they're not even going to start, well, there's almost no chance of them succeeding. So simply put, you have to put yourself, or if you're a coach, put a player in a position to succeed. And I think another big thing, okay, besides all of this, there's not enough emphasis on just getting out of analysis paralysis, just focusing on a routine rather than kind of a get rich quick scheme with ELO. So when you make your chess study a routine, then it's all much easier to do. So, for example, one of my routines was to study 4 pages per day from a chess book, just as a bare minimum. You create those bare minimum routines, and then suddenly you're doing a whole lot of useful work. All right, let's go on to the next one. What do you think are the greatest obstacles or barriers that adult improvers face? Well, there are quite a few of them. I mean, one of them can definitely be stress. And obviously, if people have a family and a lot of responsibilities, it's just really, really hard to find the time to play chess. I mean, I've seen certain players that just aren't able to set aside 2 hours a day to study chess. They're not able to set aside 5 hours one day per week to go out and play a league game. And when a player can't do that, it's very, very hard to get better when you can't even cut aside that or carve that into your schedule. So that's definitely a big one. Just the inability to play in physical tournaments. I would also say that another thing that gets in the way of many adult improvers is just self-doubt. People just think to themselves, well, I don't know anybody who did it, so maybe I can't. But it's important to not think that way. I've known a lot of players who had great achievements later in their career. For example, Larry Kaufman becoming Grandmaster in the World Senior, and International Master Emery Tate becoming IM at age 47. And I've seen some of my students go from 1600 to 2150 in less than 2 years as an adult player. So for the most part, it's really important to not kind of dwell so much on the can I do it aspect of it. That's just a really negative thing. It's important to really think from a very positive perspective and basically think, what can I do to maximize my results? What can I do to, enjoy what I'm doing, but also have the best possible outcomes? And so kind of in that vein, I would say that perfectionism is a really big problem. And it really helped me to become less of a perfectionist when I realized certain things like Dr. Kenneth Regan said, that the idea of there being this one perfect move in all chess positions, which I feel was ingrained in me somehow from older chess books that I'd read, not all of them obviously, but some seem to suggest this too strongly. And it's good to know that the research kind of bears out that very often the second best move isn't that far off from the best move. And a lot of it is having a good general understanding of the position and the general thrust of the play. So it's good news for perfectionists, just the fact that chess is somewhat forgiving. Obviously, there are a lot of positions where urgency matters, but close to 50% of positions, there is not one uniquely, clearly best move by, let's say, half a pawn. So it's quite important to realize that, so that we don't spend too much time in positions where we end up just wasting time trying to find the perfect move. So main point for kind of these obstacles that adult improvers face: try to get over analysis paralysis, try to get over perfectionism, try to get over the self-doubt however you can, try to find the time to play tournaments, try to find the time to get sleep, and try to squeeze chess into your daily routine, and try not to have too much stress when you're going to those tournaments. All right, let's go on to the next one. Do you think that your playing strength puts a ceiling on the playing strength of players you could materially help? And if so, what would that ELO rating be? Well, I would say I certainly would be out of place coaching a 2650 player. That really wouldn't make much sense. No one has asked me to do that technically as that kind of a coach. But for 2550 players, I have. And a lot of it is organizing material, giving them useful things to study, helping them with opening preparation, opening analysis, and organizing all of that. And also doing work while they're sleeping, let's say if they're playing in a tournament. So all of those things are important. Or analyzing their games right before a tournament, looking for parallels, let's say, between their games and some classic games and things they can learn from that. But yeah, it would be quite strange to coach somebody 400 points higher rated than you. That would be really, really strange. But yeah, I mean, if it's 100 or 200 points, I have had cases where I was coaching a young international master, and there was absolutely no problem. Simply because we thought very differently. And if you think very differently than a player, you kind of complement each other well. Because then in the analysis session, let's say I was much more focused on static factors of the position, just mostly focusing on improving my position and playing healthy chess, and my students focusing on all the aggressive and wild ideas and hunting for tactical weaknesses to create in the opponent's camp. So that made the analysis sessions very, very interesting, and I could help them with openings and things like that. So for the most part, it's not really about playing strength that much. It's mostly about what value can you bring to the table and how can you help out those players. All right, let's go to the next one. Which chess teacher or coach did you learn the most from? I would say indirectly, because I didn't have a chess teacher or coach before I became IM. I would say probably, well, John Nunn from his books. I read pretty much all of them I could get my hands on. But probably Peter Lukács might be the player I learned the most from. Not indirectly, because I knew a bunch of his students, and so I saw what openings they were playing. And what I saw was that he kind of advocated for an entire, let's say, metagame strategy. He had a whole philosophy of openings and a whole approach of playing a nice, consistent repertoire. And I saw that and I thought, well, even though what he's doing isn't that intimidating or threatening, it's very, very consistent, and he's setting up his students for success. He's not putting them in any positions to kind of walk into decisive knockouts in 15 moves or 12 moves. He's mostly playing safe, healthy, good chess. And it was interesting to see just the level of consistency in the opening repertoires as a whole. So I definitely rethought some of my ideas about opening play, because I guess you could say my opening thinking back then was something like, oh, well, I should always aim for the most aggressive and sharpest line. And his approach was something like, well, we can be consistent and think about the bigger picture. So that was just kind of a good meta point that I picked up from that. All right. Do you regret anything in your books or published work? No, I think a really important thing for people who are writing and publishing material is just to put out as much good material as you can, and basically publish for your students and for your old self, and really whatever you think is really helpful for players that you find yourself teaching or working with is going to be quite beneficial for a lot of players. And really, honestly, you never know what the feedback is going to be. I mean, for example, as I was telling Cyrus Lakdawala, you never know if you say something about an opening and then people go, oh, did you say that about the Budapest Gambit? Oh, you said that about the Queen's Gambit Accepted? You just can't account for for unexpected things like that. So no, I've written lots of New in Chess yearbook articles, and I've written 2 books now, and I just overall have published a lot of different things. So you can't just kind of live with the fear that someone will be upset about what you say about a certain opening or something, or a certain piece of advice for studying the classics. It's just kind of, you try to be helpful, you try to present a useful perspective, and you kind of hope that you push the conversation in the right direction, and you give people kind of tools for handling situations and just kind of a deeper perspective, maybe just a perspective they hadn't come across before. So I think that's really important. Let's go on to the next one. When should you stop analyzing your own games? This was something that was talked about quite a bit on the podcast. I was trying to think of what's some kind of device we could use to sum it up. Okay, let me try something here. How about Petco? How about, imagine this, you're at a tournament and you have 15 minutes to your hotel or house, wherever you're going, and you want to think about the game that you've just played, so that you've thought about your game quite a bit before you input it into the computer, or just input it into your personal database. So what does PETCO stand for? Well, P is positional factors. What were the positional mistakes that were made in your game? E is exchanges. Did you make any incorrect exchanges in the game that you just played? Kind of evaluate those exchanges. T is kind of transformations, different pawn structure transformations. Were there any that you missed? C would be critical moments. So an example of a critical moment might be you're just about to mate the opponent's king, and they have 1 move to defend, and you have to act with this great sense of urgency to make your attack work, because if you're too slow, they just refute the attack. So C would be critical moments, and O would be the question, who won the opening battle and why. So Petco, positional, exchanges, transformations, critical moments, and opening battle. So I'm just throwing that out there. That could be a way to help you go through that. Although, to tell you the truth, most people have phones or notepads or whatever. So what I used to do is I would just have a bunch of questions. I would have between 5 and 7 questions I would ask myself, and I would just answer those questions. And having thought about those questions, by the time that I got to my hotel room, I already had thought about the games quite a lot. So what I did was I had firm answers, or relatively firm answers, on all those questions. So what I did was I analyzed the game, and I tried to make sure that my conclusions were all correct. And so if you thought deeply about all of those important factors in your games that you've played, then really just kind of analyzing every single move for one tiny micro improvement or micro subtlety often won't be that helpful. All right, last one. Bonus question. Why are 2 rooks a potential drawback and not other pieces? This was the most confusing thing for me in the interview. Okay, that's a good question and something I didn't clearly address. So if you think about it, what pieces could we have that would be potentially fighting for the same square? Well, we start the game with 1 queen, so it's not going to be the queen. And the bishops complement each other perfectly because they're on opposite diagonals. So you can't really have redundant bishops in a normal middle game. So essentially the only 2 pieces that will really trip over each other potentially are knights and rooks. And that was something I had just really never thought about until there was one article by Mark Dvoretsky called The Superfluous Piece. I think that was one of his best Chess Cafe articles. Great article, mostly about knights tripping over each other and how you might not want to trade off pieces or trade off knights when the opponent has a very clumsy knight in a position like that. But rooks can be a factor there too. So the truth is that 2 rooks can be a potential drawback, but also 2 knights can be a potential drawback. So I hope I've answered everything here. I think that's everything for this. So I just hope I've been informative and didn't take too long.